The night erupted in a scarlet flash, a gunshot tearing through the frozen expanse of the Siberian taiga. Alexei Karpov froze, his breath catching in his throat, eyes widening at the scene before him. 3 bodies lay crumpled among the snow-draped pines, their blood steaming in the icy air. The killer had not even glanced at him. Instead, he melted into the shadows, a wraith moving with uncanny silence, leaving only the echo of gunfire and the taste of fear. Alexei felt a jolt of disbelief. The man he had hunted for weeks, the so-called traitor, had just murdered 3 seasoned operatives before his very eyes. And yet, somehow, he remained alive, untouchable, a phantom in the moonlit forest. The air was heavy with frost and the scent of blood. Alexei's hand trembled, gripping the handle of his pistol. His instincts screamed at him to chase, to run, to do anything but freeze. But there was a deeper, more primal fear clawing at him from the edges of his consciousness. The forest was alive. He could feel it pressing against him, shifting in the shadows, breathing around him. It was no longer just a pursuit. He was being hunted, and he did not yet know by whom or by what. Alexei took a deep breath, forcing himself forward, crunching through the deep snow, each step echoing in the silent void. He was an officer of the NKVD, trained to face enemies without hesitation, to extinguish life with precision and cold logic. Yet here, in the dead heart of the taiga, the rules had shifted. Each tree became a sentinel, each shadow a threat. The man he sought, Dmitry Volkov, was not merely a fugitive. He was an idea, a spark of rebellion against an unstoppable system. And Alexei had never encountered anyone like him. He was ruthless, cunning, and impossibly fast. But more than that, he seemed to know the forest in ways Alexei could not imagine. The memory of the ambush surfaced, haunting him. They had tracked Volkov to a narrow ravine, expecting him to corner him in the dead of night. Instead, he had set a trap. They had walked into it blindly, like lambs, and the night had erupted in violence. Alexei's colleagues, men he had trained with, were dead or dying, and he had barely escaped with his life. And yet, the official report would later call it a simple misfire or an operational accident. Only Alexei knew the truth. Volkov was far beyond ordinary, and the forest was his ally. The wind picked up, carrying with it the low, mournful howl of wolves. Alexei stopped, scanning the tree line. Wolves in these parts were no strangers to man, yet there was something in this sound that froze him more than any predator could. The howl was deliberate, almost ceremonial, a proclamation that he was now deep in their domain. He had entered a world governed by rules he did not understand, and he was dangerously unprepared. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, but retreat was impossible. Volkov had escaped once. If he slipped again, he would be lost forever. Alexei's training compelled him forward, but every step was heavier than the last, the snow sucking at his boots as though the forest itself conspired to trap him. His thoughts spiraled. What was he pursuing? A man? A symbol? Or perhaps something darker, something alive in the taiga that Volkov had somehow mastered? Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. Snow fell silently, muffling sound, yet the forest thrummed with life. Branches shifted without wind. Shadows moved just beyond the corner of his vision. Every instinct honed over years in the NKVD screamed that he was being watched. And he was. He could feel it. Then in a small clearing, he saw him. Volkov stood motionless, as if waiting. His face was pale, etched with lines of hunger and exhaustion, yet his eyes burned with a feral intelligence that chilled Alexei more than the cold ever could. The man had escaped countless traps, outsmarted and outmaneuvered, and now he looked at Alexei not with fear, but with the calculated calm of a predator assessing its prey. The two men regarded each other across the snow, a tension palpable as the wolves' howls wove into the night air. Alexei raised his pistol, but his finger trembled. Volkov spoke, his voice low, calm, and unnervingly familiar in its certainty. "You've come far, officer," he said, "but the forest, it does not belong to you." The words struck a nerve. Alexei had always believed in order, in hierarchy, in the system that demanded loyalty above all else. Yet here, in the shadow of ancient trees and living ice, he felt the futility of it. Volkov had harnessed something primal, something older than any government decree or ideology. And now, Alexei was forced to confront the terrifying truth. He might not survive this pursuit. Suddenly, movement erupted around him. The wolves appeared, not in timid flocks, but as a coordinated force, emerging from the darkness like ghosts. Their eyes glowed, reflecting the moonlight, sharp and unflinching. They surrounded him, cutting off escape in every direction. Alexei's pulse spiked. The cold terror he had felt before surged into raw, visceral fear. He was alone, encircled, powerless. Every weapon he carried was useless here. The wolves did not strike immediately. Instead, they observed, assessing, as if waiting for him to make a choice that would determine his fate. Volkov stepped closer, calm and unhurried, his movements deliberate. "They recognize strength, officer," he said, "but they also recognize mercy." Alexei's mind raced. The wolves were not just animals. They were a living trial, a test of judgment. Every instinct screamed for survival, for resistance, for fight. But against what? Against creatures that belonged to the forest? Or against a world he had never truly understood? The clearing seemed to shrink, the trees pressing in, the wind cutting sharper against his face. The snow beneath his boots turned into a slick, treacherous trap. He realized, with a shock, that he had been chasing Volkov into a world he could not control. And yet, the opportunity lay before him. One choice, one decision, could save him or condemn him. Volkov raised a hand, almost in invitation. "Your choice, Alexei. Run and leave this place. Or stay, and learn what it truly means to face the forest." Every fiber of Alexei's being screamed to flee, to survive, to abandon reason and retreat into the shadows. And yet, some strange, irrational part of him, the part trained to pursue, to endure, to confront, made him hesitate. He looked at Volkov, looked at the wolves, and understood that nothing in his previous life had prepared him for this moment. The forest had rewritten the rules. The hunter had become the hunted. Hours, or perhaps seconds, passed in this tense stalemate. The wolves remained statuesque, their eyes unwavering, their presence absolute. Alexei's mind spun with fear, rage, confusion, and an odd, reluctant awe. He had been a servant of the system, a man of orders and obedience, yet here he felt the fragility of his existence, the insignificance of his authority, the raw, unyielding power of nature itself. Then Volkov did something unexpected. He lowered his own weapon, stepping closer to the wolves, nodding slightly. They responded immediately, a collective shift, acknowledging his presence. He turned back to Alexei, eyes burning with quiet command. "Do you see? There is a way through, but only if you understand what it means to surrender not to them, but to yourself." Alexei's mind reeled. The officer in him resisted, struggling against the pull of instinct. But the forest, the wolves, and the man he had pursued for weeks demanded a reckoning beyond bullets or ideology. He felt the impossible weight of choice pressing on his chest, suffocating, yet illuminating. He could not run, not now, not when the answer lay so close, shrouded in fear and shadow. And then the wolves moved, not to attack, but to form a circle around the clearing, enclosing both men in an unbroken ring of fur, fangs, and predatory intelligence. Alexei realized, with a mixture of terror and clarity, that he was no longer in control of his own fate. The forest had taken it from him. The hunter and the hunted were now equals, bound by forces older than any law, any command, any allegiance. Volkov extended his hand, again, a gesture of trust, of challenge, and of inevitability. "Do you walk away?" he said softly, "or do you step into the truth?" Alexei's chest heaved. He felt the icy bite of fear, the pull of morality, the weight of choices made over a lifetime. And in that moment, he understood that some lessons were taught not by words, not by orders, but by the quiet, relentless judgment of the natural world. The forest held its breath. The wolves held their breath. And Alexei Karpov, officer of the NKVD, felt the impossible, that survival might not mean running, but choosing the right kind of courage in the face of something beyond human reckoning. Alexei's hand hovered over the snow, fingers stiff from cold and adrenaline, the rifle at his side useless against the silent judgment of the wolves. His eyes flicked between Volkov's calm, unnerving gaze and the ring of predatory shapes encircling them. Every muscle in his body tensed, every instinct screaming to act, to run, to fire, but his mind, for once, betrayed him with doubt. The forest had become a living trial, a labyrinth where human laws held no sway, where survival depended not on strength alone, but on understanding, intuition, and the courage to face an ancient, unspoken authority. Volkov spoke again, his voice low, deliberate, carrying the cadence of someone who had lived longer and harder than his years suggested. "You think you are ready to punish, to control, to assert your power, but this forest, it does not obey. It watches, it tests, it decides. And tonight, it decides through you." The wolves shifted slightly, the sound of their movement barely more than a rustle, yet it sent a ripple of dread through Alexei's spine. Their eyes reflected the pale moonlight, sharp, calculating, patient, but there was also a strange intelligence there, almost human in its perception. Alexei realized with a sudden jolt that these creatures were not just animals. They were judges, witnesses, sentinels of a law older than any state, older than any man. Volkov's gaze never wavered. "You have chased me, Alexei, believing that death is the only justice, that your duty is absolute. But sometimes, survival demands more than obedience. It demands choice." Alexei's mind raced. He had been trained to act decisively, to follow orders without hesitation, to consider mercy a weakness. Yet here, in the heart of the Siberian wilderness, all of that training seemed fragile, meaningless. The choices he had made, the loyalty he had sworn, the ideologies he had enforced, they all felt like a costume, flimsy against the raw, eternal power surrounding him. The forest seemed to lean closer, the trees bending as though eavesdropping, the wind whispering secrets through the branches. Snow drifted down, soft and silent, but every flake felt like a sentence in some cosmic trial he did not fully understand. The wolves remained still, yet their presence pressed on him with a force heavier than steel. Alexei's breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale fogging the air between him and Volkov, a ghostly veil of tension and fear. "You wonder why they have not attacked," Volkov said, tilting his head slightly. "Because they are waiting. They are waiting for the truth. Not the lie of your allegiance, not the fiction of your orders, but the truth of your heart. Will you fight them? Will you fight me? Or will you understand?" Alexei's eyes darted to the shadows beyond the clearing. Movement flickered there, subtle, almost imperceptible. The wolves were not alone. Other shapes moved in the peripheral darkness, smaller, silent, but with the same watchful intelligence. The forest had layered its guardians, each an extension of the ancient law that demanded respect. Every step forward or backward could trigger disaster, yet standing still felt equally perilous. He swallowed hard, trying to force clarity. What, what do you want from me? His voice was rough, cracking under strain. The cold had bitten his throat, but the words came anyway, trembling between defiance and desperation. Volkov smiled faintly, a shadow of amusement passing over his exhausted, sharp features. I want you to see that the path you have followed all your life, obedience, fear, control, is not the only way. You think survival is about strength. It is not. It is about choice, about courage, about knowing when to fight and when to yield. The snow seemed to grow quieter, the night heavier. Alexei felt an unnatural stillness pressing down, a kind of silence that did not merely absorb sound, but seemed to weigh on his soul. He wanted to speak, to argue, to fire his weapon, but his mind was paralyzed by the enormity of the moment. The wolves had become the measure of his existence, and Volkov was both guide and judge. Then Volkov moved closer, slowly, deliberately, every motion careful, precise, commanding the unspoken obedience of the forest itself. Alexei's hand twitched toward his pistol, a reflex he could no longer trust. He wanted to flee, to assert control, but the thought of pulling the trigger filled him with absurd futility. Against what? Against nature itself? Against a man who had mastered it? Against his own realization of how fragile human authority truly was. You are afraid, Volkov said quietly, not as accusation, but as observation. And rightly so. Fear is truth, Alexei. It tells us where we are weak, where we are honest, where we must act. But the question is not fear. The question is what you will do with it. Alexei's mind replayed everything that had led him here. The orders he had executed without question, the lives he had ended, the ideals he had sacrificed. And suddenly, the icy clarity of the forest struck him. He was not a hunter. He was prey. And the choice of survival was no longer his alone. The wolves shifted again, moving closer, yet not attacking. Their eyes were unblinking, assessing, as if peering into the depths of his soul. Alexei felt the pulse of the forest, a rhythm ancient and inexorable, matching the beat of his own heart. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that the forest had always been in control. He had simply refused to see it until now. Volkov stopped a few meters away, raising his hand once more. Do you understand now? You cannot command them. You cannot command this. You can only choose. And choice is the true measure of strength. Alexei's mind raced. He could flee, leave this place and live, perhaps, though the memory of the murdered comrades in the shattered forest would haunt him forever. He could fight, attempt to assert human dominance over the wild, and likely die in the attempt. Or he could do something neither had expected, something that demanded courage beyond any ideology he had known. For a moment, the world held its breath. The wolves' eyes glowed like lanterns in the dark. Volkov waited, serene, knowing the very embodiment of the wild's wisdom. And Alexei, officer of the NKVD, felt the impossible weight of truth pressing down. To survive, he could not merely act. He had to understand. He had to surrender, not to them, but to the forest's judgment, to the wisdom that transcended man's fragile laws. Then it happened. Volkov extended his hand fully, not as a gesture of threat, but as a bridge. The choice is yours. Do you walk away, or do you step into the reckoning? Alexei's hand hovered over his pistol, The cold burned through his gloves. His breath was ragged. He could feel the wolves' collective awareness pressing against him, felt the pulse of the ancient law vibrating in his chest. And yet, something unexpected stirred within him. Not fear, not anger, not hatred, but recognition. Recognition of the truth that had been obscured by years of duty, by ideology, by blind obedience. The forest was not an enemy, it was a mirror, and Volkov had become its voice. Slowly, deliberately, Alexei lowered his weapon. Every second felt like an eternity. The wolves did not attack. They did not even shift. The silence stretched taut, a living thing. And then, with a motion that was almost imperceptible, he reached toward Volkov's hand, letting go of the last traces of control he had clung to for decades. The moment their hands met, the forest seemed to exhale. The wolves shifted, spreading outward, creating a path rather than a trap. The night was no longer oppressive, but alive with possibility. Alexei felt a strange, almost unbearable clarity, a communion with something ancient and eternal. For the first time, he understood that survival was not about dominance, not about fear, not about obedience, but about courage, choice, and the recognition of forces far greater than oneself. Volkov gave a small, approving nod. Good, you understand. For now. The two men began to move through the forest together, each step measured, aware, respectful of the living law surrounding them. The snow crunched beneath their boots, but it no longer felt threatening. The wind carried the scent of pine and frost, and even the distant howls of wolves seemed less like a warning and more like acknowledgement. Yet Alexei could not shake the unease gnawing at the edges of his clarity. The forest had granted him insight, perhaps even survival, but it had also revealed something terrifying. Human authority was fragile. Ideology was meaningless against the raw forces of the natural world, and sometimes mercy required the surrender of all pretense of power. The lesson was liberating and devastating. Hours passed in tense, silent movement through the wilderness. Every shadow, every rustle, felt alive with potential judgment. Yet the two men moved with a strange synchronicity, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. Volkov occasionally glanced at Alexei, a flicker of something almost paternal, almost triumphant in his expression. Finally, as dawn began to stain the horizon with pale, trembling light, they emerged from the densest part of the taiga. The wolves had disappeared into the trees, leaving only the lingering sense of their presence. The snow sparkled faintly in the growing light, and the air was crisp with the smell of thaw and pine. Alexei looked at Volkov, at the man he had pursued for weeks, at the phantom who had rewritten the rules of survival itself. The words that rose in his throat were swallowed by the enormity of the experience. He realized that he could not articulate what he had learned. Not yet. Some truths were too vast for language, too raw for human comprehension. Volkov gave a faint, almost enigmatic smile. Remember this, Alexei. The forest judges us all. Sometimes mercy, sometimes justice, sometimes death. And it is never wrong. Alexei nodded slowly, understanding at last that the chase, the fear, the violence, it had all been a lesson in humility, courage, and the terrifying beauty of choice. The forest had tested him, and he had survived, not by skill, not by ideology, but by surrendering to something far older and wiser than himself. And yet, even as the sun rose, painting the snow in golden light, a low, haunting howl echoed from deep within the trees, long, drawn out, and almost human. The forest had spoken again, reminding him that the reckoning was never truly over, and that some debts, some lessons, were eternal. The forest seemed different in the light of dawn, yet no less alive. The snow reflected the pale sun, painting everything in ghostly silver. But Alexei Karpov knew it was an illusion. The forest pulse had not ceased. It had merely shifted. Hidden in the subtle sway of branches, the whisper of wind over ice, the soft crunch of snow underfoot. Each step felt like a negotiation, each breath a concession to some intelligence far older than any man-made law. Volkov walked beside him, his pace unhurried, his eyes scanning the forest as if reading an invisible script written by forces beyond comprehension. For hours they moved in silence, the weight of their shared ordeal settling over Alexei like a second skin. He had survived the first trial, but he understood now that survival was only the beginning. The forest demanded more. It demanded understanding, empathy, and the recognition of one's own fragility. Alexei's mind wandered to the men he had hunted with, the comrades who had died in Volkov's trap, and the blood that still stained the snow. He felt a wave of guilt, not just for failing to protect them, but for the blind obedience that had led them into the ambush. The forest seemed to respond to his thoughts, the wind shifting to carry a low, mournful whisper through the pines, as if it were speaking directly to him, testing his awareness, probing his conscience. "You feel it, do not you?" Volkov's voice broke the silence, soft but resonant, carrying through the trees. The forest remembers, it judges. It does not forgive blindly, nor does it punish without cause. It simply is. And we are its witnesses, Alexei, its students, if we have the courage to learn. Alexei nodded, though words failed him. Courage, choice, responsibility. These were not merely abstractions. They were forces pressing on him, as real and dangerous as the wolves that had surrounded him the night before. He felt the memory of their eyes, unblinking and luminous, and he understood that the forest's law was impartial, absolute, and eternal. They came to a narrow ravine, a steep drop where the snow hung precariously on icy ledges. Volkov stopped at the edge, peering down into the shadowed depths. The ravine seemed impossibly deep, the bottom obscured by fog and frozen mist. Alexei felt a wave of vertigo, the familiar human fear of falling, of losing control. Yet he also felt something else, an acknowledgement that the forest had brought him here for a reason. The choice would not be simple. It never was. Volkov turned to him, eyes sharp and calculating. "The final test is not violence, Alexei. It is understanding. You can take the path of fear, of self-preservation, or you can step forward and face what lies beneath, knowing that the forest's judgment is neither cruel nor kind. It is truth." Alexei's breath came in sharp bursts. He looked down the ravine and felt the pull of instinct, the desire to retreat, to cling to human certainty. But retreat was impossible, not just because of the forest, but because of what he had learned. The wolves, the snow, the silence, they had stripped him of illusions. There was no escaping this reckoning. Only choice remained. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Volkov stepped closer to the edge, glancing down as though weighing the abyss against himself. "You see, Alexei, life is not measured in obedience or orders. It is measured in moments like this, where the courage to act, to decide, defines everything." Alexei swallowed hard. The memory of his life, the arrests, the executions, the endless pursuit of loyalty pressed against him. For decades, he had believed that authority and fear were enough to command obedience and survival. Now he realized they were fragile constructs, meaningless in the face of forces that did not recognize rank, ideology, or human pride. A howl echoed from deep within the ravine, low and haunting. Alexei recognized it immediately, not just a wolf, but a collective, ancient voice, carrying judgment and expectation. The sound reverberated through the trees, shaking the snow from the branches, sending shivers down his spine. The forest had spoken again. It demanded action. Volkov turned to him, eyes filled with something more than human comprehension. Do you understand, Alexei? The choice is yours. You can run, you can hesitate, or you can step forward and claim your understanding. But know this, hesitation is surrender, and surrender is meaningless. Alexei's hand went to the pistol instinctively, but he immediately realized the absurdity. The gun was irrelevant. Against the forest, against the law that Volkov had learned to interpret, bullets were nothing. Only awareness, only the courage to confront the truth would matter. He lowered the weapon slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of decades of ideology and blind obedience lift from his shoulders. Volkov extended a hand toward him again, steady and patient. Then step forward, Alexei. Do not step for me. Do not step for them. Step because you understand what it truly means to face the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. Alexei hesitated for a heartbeat, then moved. Step by step, he approached the edge of the ravine, feeling the snow give beneath his boots, the wind biting at his cheeks. The howl intensified, resonating through the canyon, a living reminder of the forest's power and presence. Every step was agony and liberation intertwined. At the edge, he stopped, looking down into the mist. The ravine seemed infinite, a void that reflected not the forest above, but the depths of his own fear, his own conscience, his own mortality. Volkov stood beside him silently, the snow falling between them like ash, like judgment. You must decide, Volkov said softly. Will you leap, or will you turn back and live a life forever shackled by fear? Alexei's mind raced. He remembered the men who had died, the orders he had followed, the ideology he had served. He remembered the wolves' eyes, glowing in the night, the way the forest had tested him, judged him, and revealed him for what he truly was. And he understood at last, courage was not absence of fear, but action in its presence. Survival was not evasion, but understanding. He stepped forward. The snow gave way beneath his feet, and for a heartbeat, he felt the rush of air, the vertigo, the raw, naked exposure of existence itself. But the forest did not punish him. Instead, the abyss seemed to shift, solidifying beneath his feet, revealing a hidden path, a narrow ledge covered in frost, descending deeper into the heart of the ravine. The wolves howled again, this time in a chorus that was almost celebratory, acknowledging his courage, his comprehension, his surrender to forces greater than himself. Volkov moved beside him, a shadow among shadows, silent and patient. Together they descended the hidden path, the air growing colder, the snow thicker, the silence heavier. Each step was a lesson, each breath a covenant with the law of the wild. Alexei realized that the forest was not a place to conquer, it was a teacher, a mirror, a force that demanded humility, courage, and understanding. Hours passed in careful descent. The ravine opened into a wide basin, surrounded by towering cliffs and frozen waterfalls, a hidden cathedral of ice and stone. Wolves emerged from the trees, forming a perimeter around the basin, their eyes glowing like lanterns in the fading light. Alexei felt the pulse of their presence, a rhythm that synced with his own heartbeat, a living, breathing law that had welcomed him into its fold. Volkov turned to him, eyes piercing. This is the final stage, Alexei. You have survived the hunt. You have survived the test. But now you must face the ultimate choice. Life, death, freedom, or sacrifice, it all lies before you. And it is not for me to tell you what to choose. It is for you to know. Alexei's throat burned with unsaid words. He thought of retreat, of running back to the world of orders and ideology, of claiming survival through obedience. But he knew now that such survival would be hollow. The forest had stripped him bare, revealed him for what he truly was, and demanded a choice that would define him beyond life or death, beyond ideology or fear. The wolves shifted, a silent, living tribunal. The air was thick with expectation, the weight of eons pressing down on him. And then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, yet echoed through the basin, Volkov said, "Choose, Alexei. For this moment, the forest watches, and the forest remembers." Alexei closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The snow, the ice, the wolves, Volkov, the abyss, they were all part of the same lesson, the same trial. Courage was not absence of fear. Mercy was not weakness. Survival was not conquest. It was understanding. And in that understanding, he found clarity. He opened his eyes, raised his hand, and made the choice. Alexei's hand lingered in the air for a heartbeat longer than it should have, trembling with the weight of centuries of instinct and obedience. The abyss before him, the frozen basin below, the wolves circling like silent sentinels, all of it was a living testament to the truth he had only begun to understand. He realized that his life, his ideology, his pride, even his very identity, were all constructs designed to keep him safe in a world that no longer existed. The forest demanded more: clarity, courage, and the willingness to face consequences beyond comprehension. Volkov's eyes were fixed on him, sharp, assessing, yet patient. The man had survived the impossible and now stood as both guide and judge. "Alexei," he said softly, almost reverently, "the forest does not reward hesitation. You have seen its law, felt its judgment, and now the final choice rests with you. What will it be?" Alexei swallowed hard, his mind racing. The wolf's eyes glimmered like molten gold in the pale light, a reflection of truths he could barely articulate. They were not merely animals, they were extensions of the forest's will, instruments of judgment, witnesses of history, arbiters of life and death. To act recklessly would mean death. To retreat would mean surrender. The only path left was the one defined by understanding, the one that required him to confront fear and accept its lesson fully. He looked at Volkov, whose hand still extended, a bridge between survival and annihilation, fear and comprehension. In that moment, Alexei understood the depth of what was being asked of him. It was not a test of skill or courage in the conventional sense. It was a test of conscience, morality, and the courage to embrace vulnerability. The forest, the wolves, Volkov, they were all part of the same trial, and the moment of truth had arrived. Slowly, Alexei took a step forward, feeling the icy wind bite at his face, feeling the snow crunch beneath his boots with every careful movement. The wolves did not stir aggressively. Instead, they watched, silent and patient, their presence a living pulse that measured the man's heart, his intent, his understanding. Each step was a negotiation with fate itself. The abyss yawned beneath him, vast and impenetrable, yet he felt neither vertigo nor panic. Instead, he felt clarity. Volkov mirrored his movement, stepping alongside him, a shadow among shadows. "Good," he murmured. "Now, Alexei, trust. Trust what you feel, not what you know. The forest speaks in ways words cannot convey. Listen." Alexei's mind tried to absorb the rhythm of the forest, the subtle sway of trees, and the whisper of the wind, and the almost imperceptible movement of the wolves around them. It was as if every element of this hidden world carried meaning, a message encoded in instinct and observation. He realized then that his training, his past, and his beliefs, all of it had prepared him to obey, and to enforce, and to survive in a human-made order. But here, in this sacred expanse of ice, snow, and living wilderness, the rules had changed. Survival was not granted by strength, skill, or fear. Survival demanded comprehension, humility, and courage beyond mere human reckoning. A low, resonant howl erupted from deep within the basin, echoing off frozen cliffs and reverberating through the trees. The sound was more than a warning. It was judgment, expectation, and acknowledgement rolled into one. Alexei felt it vibrate in his chest, a visceral reminder that he had been chosen by circumstance to witness and participate in something far greater than himself. He knew that one wrong move, one hesitation, could bring destruction. Yet he also understood that inaction was no longer an option. Volkov turned to him, his face serious now, the faint traces of a smile gone, replaced by intensity. Remember, Alexei, courage is not the absence of fear. Mercy is not weakness. Choice defines us. And the forest will remember. Alexei felt the weight of those words settle deep within him. He had pursued Volkov for weeks, believing himself the hunter, the enforcer, the embodiment of duty and authority. Yet the truth now struck him like lightning. He had been prey all along. The forest, Volkov, and even the wolves had orchestrated a lesson, revealing the fragility of human constructs, the illusion of control, and the depth of responsibility that accompanies choice. Then the wolves moved, not aggressively, not with teeth bared, but in a silent, coordinated shift, creating a pathway through the basin. The path was narrow, treacherous, and demanding, but it offered a passage that required skill, courage, and trust in instinct. Alexei realized that the forest was not punishing him. It was offering him a chance to prove that he had learned its law, that he understood its rhythms, that he could navigate not with force, but with comprehension. He took the first careful steps along the path, snow crunching beneath him, ice slick beneath his boots, heart pounding with anticipation and fear. Volkov followed, silent and measured, a presence that was both reassuring and unnerving. The wolves flanked them, their eyes unblinking, watching, judging, teaching in ways Alexei could barely perceive. Each step required focus, balance, and trust, not only in the physical path but in the lesson that the forest demanded he internalize. Halfway along the ledge, Alexei stumbled, his boots slipping on the ice. For a heart-stopping moment, he felt the abyss beckon, the possibility of death looming. But instinct and the lesson learned over hours of observation and trial guided him. He corrected his step, balancing with a precision he did not know he possessed, feeling a surge of triumph and understanding. The forest, it seemed, acknowledged his growth, responding in the subtle sway of branches and a low, approving chorus of howls. Volkov's gaze met his, a flicker of approval